Welcome to the screencast for The Elements of Argument by Stephen M. Kahn, Patricia Kitcher, and George Scher. This article is on page 45 of our textbook, and it's going to talk to us about reasoning, different ways that we use reason to come to conclusions. And all reasoning is what we do when we defend our beliefs. So in order to reason well, we have to ensure, one, that we don't contradict ourselves, and two, that the evidence we use in the defense of our beliefs is adequate for the conclusion. That means that all of the premises are relevant and none of them contradict one another, and they're not vague or ambiguous, amongst other things. So our three authors first give us the logical definition for what an argument is. I've told you about this a couple of times. This is on the bottom of page 45. And it says, a collection of sentences consisting of one or more premises and a conclusion. And that's it. So once we know that, we should figure out what differentiates a good argument from a bad argument. They say on page 46, right at the end of the introduction, a chain of argumentation is exactly as solid as the arguments it contains. If any link is weak, then the entire chain will break down. From a logical point of view, the crucial aspect of arguments is the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Logic is the branch of philosophy that studies the inferential relations between premises and conclusion. The task of logic is to establish rules or guidelines about which claims can be inferred from other claims. So how is it that we use one statement to prove another statement? We make an inference. We deduce something or induce it. And we're going to take a look at deductive arguments first. So remember, when we're studying reasoning, we are always interested in the relationships between statements. Does one actually lend evidence to another or not, and why? When we look at deductive arguments, validity is the central concept. And the definition of it is here at the top of the slide. It says that a deductive argument is valid if and only if the following relation holds between the premises or evidence and its conclusion. And that is, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So if the evidence is true, the conclusion must be true. This is just a logical relationship between statements. The contents of the statements don't matter at all to its validity. They matter, of course, for the truth of the statements, but only the structure of the argument matters for the concept of validity. So this text box here is from your textbook on page 47, and it shows different ways that arguments can either be valid or fail to be valid. So let's take a look at them here. In argument 1, this is a valid argument, but one or more of the premises are false, which makes the conclusion false, even though it's a valid argument. So premise number 1 is wombats belong to the order of marsupials. Premise 2, koalas belong to the order of marsupials. C, wombats and koalas belong to the same order. Oh, I misspoke there. This is a valid and true argument. So both of the premises and the conclusion are true. And you can see how this relationship makes it such that the conclusion is contained inside of the other two statements. So there's no possible way outside of its truth if P1 and P2 are true. Now in 2, this is the one that actually has false premises and thus a false conclusion, even though it's a valid argument. Premise 1. All philosophers lived in ancient Greece. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher. Bertrand Russell lived in ancient Greece. So we know P2 is true. We know P1 is false because Bertrand Russell lived in England and in the United States. So if it were the case that P1 and P1 were 2, then C would have to be true. But since P1 is false, that makes the conclusion false. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. Premise 1, all canaries are polar bears. Premise 2, all polar bears have feathers. C, all canaries have feathers. Okay, so this, of course, is not a correct argument, but the conclusion is in fact true. So we have one or more false premises and a true conclusion. Finally, okay, in number 4, an argument can have true premises and a true conclusion and still be invalid. So remember, all that we mean by validity is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So premise 1 is some roses are red, some violets are blue. Those are both true. And C, some flowers give people hay fever. So you can see that the premises aren't as tightly related to the conclusion. There's no deduction from P1 and P2 to C. C is not contained already in the evidence. So it is not a valid form of deductive argumentation. Okay, so we've seen every sort of format that a valid argument can possibly take in 1, 2, and 3. The only thing that validity rules out is that if an argument is valid, both premises can't, or all the premises can't be true and have the conclusion be false. We're just, again, if this is a little bit of a lot for you, just remember that we're talking about logical relationship of statements alone. So if you want to determine the truth of a valid argument, you need to have separate knowledge as to whether or not the premises are in fact true. There are a couple of other examples in the textbook on page 47, and I'll leave that up to you to take a look at once you get the textbook. Sometimes though, even though you don't know the truth of the premises, you can disregard certain arguments if the premises themselves are too vague or ambiguous. On page 48, there's another example, and it is premise 1. The Constitution requires that public education be theologically neutral. Premise 2. The theory of evolution is really just a religious doctrine. Conclusion. Therefore, since evolution is taught in schools, the biblical account of creation should also be taught in order to ensure theological neutrality. Now, the authors of our paper say that P2 is questionable, but all we have to do is look at P1 to know that this argument can be dismissed as not valid, even though its premise seems a bit more acceptable. And we can focus on the phrase, theologically neutral. Now, the way this phrase has been interpreted in the interpretation of the Constitution for the past couple hundred years is that public education should not have an element of theology at all. Not that there should be a balancing between theology and something that is against theology. So, the only thing that makes something ambiguous is if it has more than one definition and the person who is talking about the phrase or word doesn't tell us which definition applies. In this argument, that makes the phrase theologically neutral an ambiguous phrase. And as such, we cannot know for certain that they haven't shifted between the meanings or chosen the wrong meanings when they use the phrase multiple times. So we can just reject this out of hand, even if we don't know whether or not the premises are true. Now, if we kept ourselves locked in to only deductive reasoning to figure out what's true and false about the world, or which beliefs are better supported than others, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Most of the evidence we come across is not so easily tied together in the same really strict logical format. So we want to be able to accept good evidence as providing good grounds to conclude something about a topic without knowing for sure, without saying that we're guaranteed the truth if the premises are true. So most of the time we're using non-deductive reasoning. We'll look at three kinds of induction, which is what we call it. So we looked at deduction, and now we're going to look at induction. And these three types of reasoning are very closely related to one another. It's all about the more evidence you gather, the more likely your conclusion is to be true or well supported. And we'll look at induction, hypothesis testing, and inference to the best explanation. So on page 49, our authors have a definition for induction for us. And they say when we use induction to reason, we rely on similar observed cases to infer that the same event or property will recur in as yet unobserved cases. So when we're young and we touch the oven, that's a case. We learn that the oven's hot and we shouldn't touch it. When we go near a pan that's been in a fire, that's another case that when something's hot, we shouldn't touch it. We think that the past will match the future, so we gather case after case after case, and it lends strength to our conclusion that we've come to from the evidence. But we can never have all of the physical evidence that is possible. It's not in our textbook, but one of the traditional examples is that of the black swan. If you had never seen a swan before and you went out to a lake and you saw a white swan, that would be one instance where you could say swans are white. And say you went back to that same lake or even different lakes all over the world and you saw more and more swans and they were all white. You would, with a relatively high percentage, be able to say all swans are white. But you and I both know that there are actually black swans out there. They're just very rare compared to white swans. So even though you have a good bulk of evidence, you could possibly be wrong. So the more evidence that we gather from repeated cases, the more reasonable it is to conclude the truth of the claim or premise or theory. Hypothesis testing is very similar, but in this, we might not always have direct evidence, or the phenomena could be incredibly complex. So we're going to need to rely on indirect evidence and chains of reasoning. So when we have a hypothesis to when we propose a hypothesis to see if it fits the data, the goal is that when we try to figure out if it's true or false, we consider things we would expect to observe if the hypothesis were true. So if A is true, then B and C and D are likely to happen. So we go out in the world and we go see if B and C and D are observable. And if they are, our hypothesis is strengthened. If the opposite of them are, or there's just nothing, then it's a strike against the hypothesis. Our text uses the example of a small town hit with a mysterious illness. How do you think you would form a hypothesis to test for what is making the residents sick? So this is a complex situation. It could be any number of things. So first, you look to see what has changed about the town. And they say, well, a hypothesis could be that there's a new chemical plant and the chemicals might be making people sick. So they might examine the drinking water, both near the chemical plant and farther away. They might observe the animals who live around the chemical plant to see if they present with similar symptoms. The next one the textbook talks about is inference to the best explanation. So you might have heard from lots of different places that Sherlock Holmes is a deductive detective. And instead, he's not really deductive in the sense that the evidence that he uses, if true, prove that the conclusion must be true. Remember, that's what we mean when we say that an argument is deductive. Instead, he uses inference to the best explanation. And it's a lot like hypothesis testing. The standard of proof is a lot lower, however. So when you're presented with a whole bunch of facts about a situation, the entirety of them, all of them taken together, sometimes points you toward a conclusion. They all make sense together. And that's what the inference to the best explanation counts as. We know it's possible that another claim also explains all of the facts, but we choose the one that fits the best until further evidence is provided. So we can take a look at the example from Sherlock Holmes that the textbook uses, and this is on page 51. Holmes says, "I knew you came from Afghanistan. From long habit, the train of thought ran so swiftly through my mind that I arrived at the conclusion without being conscious of intermediate steps. There were such steps, however. The train of reasoning ran. Here is a gentleman of a medical type, but with the air of a military man. Clearly army doctor, then. He's just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, and that's not the natural tint of his skin, for his wrists are fair. He's undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured. He holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly in Afghanistan. The whole train of thought didn't occupy a second, and then I remarked you came from Afghanistan, and you were astonished." So this is him meeting Holmes, and it was true. But we know that it doesn't have to be the case that he's tan because he was in the tropics. He might have gone to a tanning bed. He might have gotten injured anywhere doing anything. But when you take all the facts together, and of course you have awareness of the context of your time and place, then you can infer to the best explanation. Now, once you have recognized that someone is arguing a arguing evidence to point to a conclusion, no matter which type of reasoning they're using. You can analyze their argument. So this can come in any format: a newspaper article, a blog post, a documentary, a friend or family member persuading you to do something. And if you want to see if their chains of reasoning make sense and are logical and reasonable, you can perform an argument analysis. First, you find the conclusion. Sometimes people don't even say it outright, they just imply it. Sometimes it's in the beginning, middle, or end of whatever material is in front of you. You find that, you write it down. Then you look for all premises, the ones they state directly, and the ones that they imply or assume. Also, you might want to cut out the rhetoric, the things that aren't real pieces of evidence, but are instead diversions or emotional manipulations, or don't quite come up to the standard of actual argumentation. And then you place this, they say, the authors in our book say, is the most difficult part, when you trace a plausible route from the premises to the conclusion. Remember, we're always talking about how the premises are related to the conclusion. So we want to figure out which premises support other premises and which premises directly support the conclusion. Is the evidence strong enough for how big or small the claim is? And that's where we'll be appraising the success or failure. In the next article, we're going to talk about a couple of ways to notice common logical fallacies, which would count as a failure. Now, of course, this kind of analysis isn't often straightforward, but it is valuable to you in your arsenal of critical thinking. It says in the text, if we give up trying to understand reasoning, then we must either naively accept the arguments of others as if we were children, or play the cynic and forswear the possibility of learning from the insights of others. And I really like that, because we all don't want to think we're like children in that we accept whatever people present to us. But a lot of times people will put up this front of learnedness where they're cynical all the time, where they reject everything. And that's equally unhelpful. If we are trying to gain knowledge about the world, we want the ability to trace the middle path where we can find plausible evidence to support the belief that comes closest to the truth that we can find.